Hello, everyone out there in, I guess you might say, agentic AI land, but otherwise known as the New Stack Agents show. This is Frederick Lardenois show, who's on the show floor today, the Okta show floor, and he's been given a little space inside the convention center before they open things up, actually the trade show floor. Our guest today is David. Hello, David. How are you? David is the founder of Sentry and well known in the space. David Cramer, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
David has been doing Sentry for a while. We just asked him how long it's been. He's like, oh my gosh, the project or the actual company. And it goes back to 2015 when you got funding. And I guess before then, the project itself, had started. I'm going to just get started right into things. Then, Frederick, why don't you then join in? But, David, can you tell us a little bit about those days back in the 2010, 2015 timeframe? What led to you starting the project? And maybe you could talk a little bit about, how, it evolved in its first years, and then we can move into where it is today.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think this is actually fun because a lot of then is kind of like now. I always tell people that the internet and so I guess the tech industry, if you will, has been boring for like the last decade. Like most of the problems have been solved. And when I got my start and when I was building things like Sentry, you just kind of, databases were still a problem, for example. We didn't have a lot of distributed systems. And so it was still a little bit of the Wild West, right? There were still big companies kind of getting off the ground and Microsoft still existed, but it was very much like still in that early industry cycle. And Sentry is just one of those random things I built during that and happened to be useful, fortunately. And then it also happened to be monetizable, great happy accidents there. And then, I just did a lot of open source tech and Sentry, we're not open source anymore. We're something called fair source, but Sentry is just one of those things. And it was always like dev infra or libraries or something along those lines. Basically things that make my life easier and things that I wanted to share with my peers. And so just kept working on it, kept sort of improving it. And, and obviously it's grown a lot since then. But it's great to have product market fit for 15 years. So, and then these days, obviously it's a lot different. We're a much bigger company. We do a lot more, a lot of market saturation. But I think the cool correlation, especially with the agentic stuff, is like, we're kind of in that time again where there's a lot of unsolved problems and a lot of uncertainty, but it's like the fun kind. Well, we have the fun kind of uncertainty over here, and then there's the rest of the world going on. That's the unfun kind of uncertainty. But it does feel a little bit like because I just turned 40, so you take that for what you will. It feels a little bit like early career for me right now in the industry, and a lot of new, interesting, exciting things. So,
what did that early Sentry feel like? When did you actually realize this was? Because it sounds like you were working on quite a few projects at the time, right? When did you realize, oh, Sentry is the thing I really want to go all in on?
It's just like a natural forcing function. Somebody convinced me to bootstrap the cloud service for it. And then people came and paid money, and thus I had to support those people, and people kept coming. And so literally just like accidental in a lot of ways. I do not care about error monitoring or application monitoring or any of these problems. I just like solving problems. And so I have a lot of strong opinions about all these things, obviously, and I have a lot of domain expertise, but it's not like I'm like obsessed with it or anything, and I wasn't obsessed with finding a project that was like going to be big or finding something that was going to be a business or something. I just like building technology, and, this is one of those things that was valuable, like at every company I joined. So, and I think we knew we had something. Like it was pretty quick. Like I did it. So we raised money in 2015. When we raised money, we already had a couple thousand customers. And we made real revenue at that point. And so clearly already then we knew there was a thing. But even before that, it had become like a full-time job, for better or worse, while I had another full-time job. That's how, something's got to give when your schedule gets overloaded like that. And I think everybody dreams of like, oh yeah, I can just work on my own thing, which good and bad, by the way. But yeah, it was just like, honestly, this natural progression. Still looks like a natural progression a lot in the company, even though we're venture backed at this point.
So when you talk about open source, I was reading a little bit about the history of your project, and you just realize open source made things easier for you. Isn't that right? To solve those kinds of problems?
Yeah. I'm a lot of things I do in life are not very intentional. They're accidental, and they're accidental because I'm like, oh, this makes sense. I'm just going to do this, or this seems interesting to me. And open source, I'm like, oh, it just makes sense. I want to share my code. I like when other people share their stuff with me so I can use it. Why wouldn't I just keep doing that? And so it's just always been part of my career. And Sentry, we still try to, we've kind of reverse engineered the business around things that we thought were more interesting ways to build stuff. And so like the open source thing is not necessarily the right thing to stick into a business model. It just complicates everything. It commoditizes the market, et cetera. The fact that like Sentry is like super low price, for an enterprise software company, also not a normal thing you would see in our thing, but it sounded like more fun. And so that's literally everything we've done. And the good thing is it all ties together. We basically have taken all this and we're like, we have this like saying internally. And it's like a lot of enterprises, like they really focus on like the Global 2000 or the Fortune 500 or something like this. And I might have stolen this from somebody, but we're like, oh, no, we don't like that. It's like the Fortune 500,000, because actually our like fundamental goal, like the North Star measurement we have inside of Sentry is like every company should use Sentry, not because we've tricked them, but because it's inherently valuable and we've done such a good job that every company wants to use the software we're building. And that's not like a rational business goal. It's just like we want to do that,
So why'd you go to fair source, and what do you mean by fair source?
Yeah, I'm like one of those. I have this point of view that nothing's free in the world, and people shouldn't take advantage of each other at the same time. And so like open source is one of those things where it's like a give and take relationship where, you use somebody's software. If you can, you should try to contribute back financially or something like that. Obviously, we're a business. We can easily contribute back. Fair source was sort of this thing where I was getting plagued with people trying to take Sentry and commercialize it that were not part of our organization. And then we're not part of the open source community either, to be honest with you, as other just commercial entities. They were trying to monetize it. And I'm like, this is just like, it makes me mad. That's all. It's just like, it was a completely, I would argue rational, but irrational in the point of view of like, I didn't really have to do it. But I'm like, look, we're just going to stop them. We're going to change the license to something that we inherently believe achieves the goals we have, which is like, we want everybody to use our software. We don't want people getting like a free ride, like especially other venture-backed companies to just like take our software and commercialize it because like we have to fund our own development. But we also don't want to have two different versions of our software, like the, open source free version and then the really good version that everybody actually wants that costs like an arm and a leg or whatever. And so we came up with this thing called Fair Source, which the TLDR, it's a license that has very few strings attached. Gotta love the Apple emojis. And so it basically just says you can't like sell a competing cloud service that uses our tech. And so you can't create Sentry2.io or whatever, right? But you get all the same features. It's all source available on the internet. Literally, it's like the same code we run in production for all of this. And after 2 years, when a commit goes live on GitHub, after 2 years, that commit is Apache licensed. So you can do whatever you want with it after that. Actually, the majority of our software is Apache licensed at this point. And we thought that was a pretty good like give and take there, since most users honestly just want like access to software. They want like free as in beer or whatever. And so I don't know. We'll see. I'm not a fundamentalist. I just don't care. I'm like, no, this makes rational sense to me. So
that's a discussion we've had in the industry for a while now, right? When it comes to Reddit or other companies that made similar moves, right? So we've been through that. Moving maybe over to agents as well and AI now, right? When did you realize that? When did you have your first customers who actually came to you and said, "This is something we want you to focus on now"?
In the agent space specifically?
Yeah, or AI in general. I don't know what came first, but it's.
I don't know that we're to the point of where customers are necessarily asking for stuff. I think if they are, they're more like, we don't know what's going on. Help us, like, please, like maybe there's some magic in here. Like I will say,
is there magic?
Unclear. There's some interesting stuff you can do with the tech. I'll talk about that. But I think if you look at it, it's a disruptive tech, which is exciting for everybody in the space. It's also clearly there is value to extract there. How close we are to that, we don't know in the industry. But there's a lot of smart people investing lots and lots of money. And like, I'm not saying everybody doing it is smart, but there's a lot of them that are very, very smart. And when everybody's looking at the same thing, there's something there. And it's very easy to ignore the hype waves in Silicon Valley. Sometimes they turn out like crypto.
Is it easy to? That's
Oh yeah, it's very easy because you can just be you can be sort of that like pessimist about the whole thing, right? Like you can be like, no, this is all BS again. Which I think every one of these, there's a good amount of BS in it, and then there's a good amount of like, okay, maybe there's something here. And this one was like, once you kind of live some of the experiences, you're like, okay, this is like phenomenal as a tech demo. And it's still super early in what it can do, and it's getting better and better. And so we kind of saw some of that, and we're like, okay, how would this apply to us? And we weren't really thinking of it from the business angle because it's like an interesting component from just how people live in fear over their existing businesses because it is such a disruptive technology. But we thought of it more like, does this change what we do? Does it mean we can do other things? And our natural sort of inclination there was, well, what is Sentry good at? Well, Sentry's really good at helping you debug whatever's wrong with your software in production usually, right? Because we capture all this information. Okay, can we make it better to debug things? Could we make it so like we can actually just like go beyond debugging things? And so you think about code generation and stuff. And but this was very much for us. It's just proactive. We think like there's a possibility that some of these things become real life. Today they're not really. Like you can definitely do some cool things with the tech, but code gen, for example, it's super early. You can generate a lot of code, but you're not really building much in terms of like true production grade software with it yet today. Like just little bits here and there. But one thing we did find that's really good, which is obvious. So Sentry has this big network of data, right? Like we have errors and then we have a bunch of other data like logs and some other stuff. And we connect all that together via what's called a trace ID. It's just a universal request ID. We did this pre-LLMs because, when you can sort of figure out how these pieces of data are linked, it makes it usually easier to debug complex problems. Again, makes sense. It's just a logical thing. Turns out it's even better with LLMs because they're phenomenal at large-scale pattern matching. And so one of the first things we found, actually, there are two first things we found that the technology was super good for our business. One, a core part of Sentry is aggregation. I have an error. I have another error. Are they the same error, right? That is a ton of, from the engineering folks in the room, that is a ton of if statements and regular expressions and things like that to make all that work. Like a lot. It's a huge amount of branching. We improved that massively with embeddings. And this must be 18 plus months ago or something at this point. So that's quite old in the grand scheme of how things have been evolving. So that was like the first interesting thing we did, which kind of makes sense because it's able to like just figure out these components a little bit more loosely. And to be clear, it doesn't replace any of the tech. It augments and expands what it does. And so that's really important for folks to understand. The second thing we found is going back to that trace thing is just because the interconnected data, we're actually able to summarize a lot of data in the system. And it's able to phenomenally like root cause problems, like in a way that you would do as a human. And this is the analogy I give people. I have a bunch of friends because, I've been around for a while that work in big companies and they're like staff, principal engineers, whatever. They don't seem to do a lot. They get paid enormous amounts of money and they generally hate their jobs. And I think for a long time, I didn't understand why they exist, like why companies would value them so highly. And then I realized what it is for like true seniority in engineering. It's about being able to theory craft how systems work. And the only way you can do that is if you have domain experience in those systems. And a lot of these big companies, the domain experience is really just that company. It's like very specific to that company. And I use this analogy because when you're thinking about like, well, I have this high paid engineer. So when there is a concern, they're definitely going to understand what's going on very quickly, right? And you can actually do a lot of that with LLMs now, that is very, very cool. And so I'm not a pessimist, but I'm definitely a skeptic by nature. And we were building this prototype, and by default, I'm like, I take convincing to believe something is good. And so they show it to me, and I'm like, look, it's not going to work. And I gave it if you've ever seen a JavaScript error, they're super cryptic. I gave it just like, maybe not the worst JavaScript error I could find, but like bottom 10 kind of thing. It gave me an answer, like a root cause and what it thought was the problem that I was like, see, it's totally wrong. And then the next day, somebody hit the same error in prod and like DM'd me with it. And I'm like, holy shit, it was right. And that was the day I'm like, okay, just ship it. It's fine. Like, it's good enough. Let's go. It's not that interesting of a problem, but like, it is one of those things that are like, okay, this is very cool that you can do this. It's just like a minor like cliff note, arguably, in what these machines are capable of. But I think we forget about that because this is not a chat bot. It's just like stringing together useful data.
So what do you think happened between day one and day two?
What do you mean? Oh,
day one where like you said this is baloney, and then the next day where
I just wasn't convinced because I saw it. I'm like, there's no way this makes sense. It's hallucinating, if you will, right?
What happened in the meantime between day one and day two then?
Literally nothing. It took validation from a human for me. And then I went and I did the work because JavaScript in general is quite complex to debug, generally speaking, compared to other programming languages. But when I had that human validation, I'm like, okay, maybe there's something, maybe this is actually correct. And I jumped into it. I'm like, wow, it was actually right. It actually identified what looked like a completely random like problem from the data I was looking at. But it was actually truthfully the problem. And no change in the technology. I didn't trust it, And I think that's fair. You probably should not trust these systems because it's called GenAI for a reason, right? It's not necessarily scientific, but it is impressive what it can do with the capabilities, And I do think we're still at the beginning, even if the tech doesn't improve, like even if the models kind of plateau. I think it's going to take us so long to actually like do any like real applied engineering on top of this, but that was just like one of the earliest memories I have at Sentry where I'm like, oh, okay, there is something here. There is like something we can extract that's like genuinely really, really interesting,
So with bug detection, for instance, it can go, you can review a lot of code through bug detection, and you can find bugs. Why isn't it ready for production quite yet? Is it just not reliable enough? Is it tend to hallucinate? What are the things that you will look for and say, oh, yes, this isn't going to work versus yes, this is going to work?
Yeah, I think one problem is reliability. And so they have all these benchmarks. So if you think about the way the models are used in sort of developer tooling, which is primarily code gen, but there's also code review and some other stuff that happens. One, there's just like, they're so far from like even if it was 90% reliable, 10% is a lot of gap, right? If we're honest with ourselves about daily work. So that, and they're not remotely close to 90%. There's these benchmarks that'll be like, oh, it passed 70% of the assessments. And I think if you put it up against the real world, it passes like 7% of the assessments or something, in the sense of like, you ask it for something with the appropriate information and it actually gives you the result you wanted. And I think sometimes that's human error. Like we sort of infer a lot of context because we have so much knowledge in our head, right? I think other times it struggles because again, it's mostly just like I always reason about it as pattern matching. Like if it can't see sort of prior art, if you will, to scope a problem, how is it going to possibly reason through it? And so I think the problem is you just end up where it's really good at certain things, and because it can do certain things, we're like, okay, what if it could do the next thing? And it just goes off the rails in the sense of it will. I'll give you an example. One of my hobbies is astrophotography. Take a telescope with a camera, point it at the sky, right? And I was vibe coding, if you will, using Codex CLI to just generate like an overlay for a Twitch stream that would show like telescope stats and all this. I gave it the API spec, as in I gave it the exact endpoint and I gave it the payload that would be returned. It completely fabricated everything from there. Like it fabricated not just what data might be returned, it just assumed magically some other data might return. But it went beyond that and it fabricated the disconnect between, okay, I've got this data and then I want to put it here. It just made up like completely different sort of payload exchanges in there, which honestly I was surprising because that usually doesn't happen when you give it like very, very specific context. But I think it also goes back to like the reliability is an issue. And so like you can't really use it to build production systems, at least from a purely agentic way, if you will. I think it's much like we are very much at the phase, and I think we're going to be at this phase for like quite a long time where it is truly like human in the loop nonstop. But it's a great enabler for, moving faster on some things. For code review, I think is really exciting as well. Like, there's dozens of companies, including us, that have an investment in that space. And it's like, it doesn't actually have to be correct because there's still a human there, right? It's like, well, if it can find some bugs that maybe you didn't have to find or you didn't find yourself, that's a net win, like just net positive in productivity. And so those are the areas that I think are really exciting versus sort of the make-believe of like, what if engineers didn't write code anymore and we just wrote English? Like, okay, what if? But like, that's not happening anytime in what we can see,
How do you, because you're launching your first AI, really AI-enabled products now at Sentry as well, right? And, on the one hand, you sound a little bit more skeptic than some of the people we have on this show. But on the other hand, you're also launching your first AI products and really AI-centric products now, right? Like how do you square those two, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what I talked about. Like everything we're doing is not designed for full autonomy. there are some cool things that we can do autonomously, but like we have this thing that will root cause and generate a patch for a bug in Sentry. The patch generation is awful. Like I will be the first to tell you that it is not that good. And everybody's patch generation is awful, and that's fine. That's the state of the technology. It's okay. The root cause is really good, somewhat reliable, but there's this big delta that's really, really hard to go from like sort of point A to point B in some of these systems. Like, yeah, we'd love to have it so we could automatically fix every bug. That will probably never happen, at least not with the technology that is present today in the world. I doubt LLMs are the solution to that kind of thing, but we know we can't do that yet. Maybe one day, so we can sort of incrementally build towards that. But what we can do today is like, okay, maybe we can much more effectively get you to sort of that cause so you can debug faster. Maybe we can propose a solution that may or may not be right. And it actually doesn't matter because we're not applying the solution. We're just saying, hey, we kind of think maybe this is what it is. And I think that's part of it is like being honest, like truthful about what the thing is. And I'm very much like anybody who knows me will tell you that like that's all I am is honest. That's my entire brand. And so I think that's also why I come off as a skeptic. And I would argue I have credibility here. I've spent the better part of 4 months building a production service at Sentry.
For sure.
Purely using Claude Code and Codex CLI. No like code written by hand. And it is very frustrating sometimes. No matter the complexity of the feature, it can be quite hard to get it to do what you want.
Did you put that in production in the end? Did you get it?
Yeah, it's in prod. It's our MCP service.
Okay.
So like our core MCP service it didn't start as code generated. I wrote it by hand originally, but at this point it's purely code gen. And you know, I wouldn't say the code is perfect in a lot of ways, but it's reliable and it's serviceable. So that's okay. It's probably secure, you know, as secure as any software at the very least. But it does take sometimes it takes an enormous amount of work to do what is trivial otherwise. And that's where I'm like, you know,
is this why you need context more and more to help with the reasoning?
Yes, but I think like the term's a little bit overloaded today. Here's my belief, and I'm not an academic, and so this is purely I am very good at building things, and that's it. I don't know anything about the underlying fundamentals of technologies. There's no science in this. I sort of have this point of view that this is the way I reason about it, at least. If it's good for a human, it's good for a machine. But because humans are so capable, we often would not do things that are good for humans. A really good example is documentation. You can always, nobody's going to disagree that documentation is good, right? But it's like, well, do we really need to document that? Do we really need to explain this? We can go ask the person if we need that. And so you would just shortcut a lot of things. Turns out that's also important for a machine, if not more important for the machine, because it can't actually handle any context. It's like really bad at context management. And so I think that kind of stuff is actually really, really important. But the problem with context, this is the way I explain it to people is like, one, we need to be able to handle, the agents need to be able to handle so much more context than they can today. And I'm talking, to me, I think it's like 2 orders of magnitude. It's an insane amount that's a gap because you basically have to reteach it everything over and over. And so the solution to reteach it is like you build some context, right? You build docs or you feed it something else, which sort of works, but then you hit a second, and that only works at minimal scale, but you hit a second issue really fast, which I describe as recall, which is like, even within that context, which gets worse and worse the larger the context window right now, it struggles to retain accuracy for the things you've already given it for information. Like that example where I gave you where the API payload, it just kept messing it up. I'm like, I gave you the exact thing 5 different times in this at different courses of this conversation, and the results are different. And this is actually like a really big problem. And so generally the way these systems work is you have like something like the agents.md file. You give it some rules in there, right, for how you want to do things. But it doesn't retain those rules. Some of them it will, but it feels like random sometimes. And I think it's based on how heavily weighted stuff is in the training data set. But I've worked around this, which is not great. So for example, in one of my agents files, because the context is important, I say, you must always follow docs or something like this. Always look up the docs in the repo before doing a task. It will not do that. It'll completely ignore that probably after like the third sort of step in a prompt, like the third time you prompt the agent, right? So what I do instead is I actually just prefix every single prompt with what I want to be enforced. And I just use like a Claude Code hook to do this. And it works, but it breaks a number of other things. And so this is like a real problem that, again, I'm not an academic. I have no idea how they're going to solve for this, but it is fundamentally a huge gap with the agents. And like model improvements certainly will help here and whatnot. And sure, you can train up-to-date models every day of the week, but they're still never going to know. They're not magic. They don't just know things, right? And so you have to feed them things like documentation or source code or whatever. And I think I don't know. I think we're really, really early in this journey yet, but it is very important.
What about, obviously Sentry, monitoring agents and monitoring these agents? What is different there for you, and how are you doing that right now? How's that working at all? Because all the concepts of, they're similar but different from what you've been doing in the past.
So I think that first part is important. They're similar, and they're very, very similar. They're probably like 99% similar and 1% different. And so when you look at things like agent monitoring, well, it's like, what is actually different? Okay, well, some might say, well, like, you actually really care about the messages, right? Okay, I always cared about the inputs. Inputs were always how I debug systems. Now there's some qualitative stuff that's very, very different, right? Like, because like these are non-deterministic systems. So I think that's the 1%, which probably is worth a lot more than 1%. But the way the systems work and machines operate and communicate, still exactly the same as all technology before it. We use a lot of fancy words to describe, like agents are just services, right? Tools are just RPC calls, if you will, or IPC calls. And so I think once you start rationalizing, it's like, it's just technology at the end of the day. How would you debug or monitor or like build technology? And it's the same thing. So we focus on a lot of like, okay, make this work within the context of like, we just build software. These are still software fundamentals. Errors still exist. They're still the same concept, right? And then on the quality, and so we have a bunch of stuff that'll monitor these, and then just use like trace semantics logs are still logs, errors are still errors. They haven't changed at all. Metrics are still metrics, right? There are things you obviously care about that are like curated. So we've tried to, like, a little bit is like open telemetry, a little bit's our flavor on top of it, but things like, you obviously want to understand token consumption and things like this. If nothing else, it's not always about pricing. Token consumption is actually one way you optimize context. So the fewer tokens you can use, obviously, for anything, the better you can manage the accuracy of that context window that you provided. So we do a bunch of like sort of curated stuff in that, but it looks like the rest of our monitoring, in all honesty. And then we're trying to decide, there's like two interesting areas that we're thinking about. One is there's a big conversation in evals. And the way I reason about evals is there are a bunch of concepts in software engineering that are exactly the same. So take away agents. Synthetic uptime monitoring is testing. Testing is testing, like in CI/CD, right? Smoke test. There's all these flavors of that kind of thing. And then there's sort of like traditional QA. All of this is exactly the same kind of thing. It's like I craft a way to sort of ideally repeatedly test a thing and repeatedly look for the same result, right? And if you look at evals, that's all it is. And so it's an interesting way because we've actually never had a great way to describe that concept, but there's like online evals and offline evals and all this stuff. But if you look at the nature of evals, mostly they're just like, okay, I have an LLM that is actually going to be the test. Like, it's just going to validate that thing does it, right? And sure, you can do it to do qualitative testing, but we're looking at it from the point of view of like, well, actually, if you use this LLM as a judge concept, there's a lot of ways you could do it. Imagine if you could just stick a trace into it that has nothing to do with a chatbot. Like, I've just got a trace that's a normal, traditional CRUD application. Could I write a rule using an LLM that better evaluates if there's a problem in that trace or in the set of logs or something like that? And so I think there's a lot of cool approaches there, and we're starting to explore some of that. We call them detectors for what it's worth, but that's just like how we think about the mental model. And then I think beyond that, the rest of it just, it comes down to a lot of these challenges for how do you just make the systems like work efficiently and reliably, and that's really hard. But I don't know. I would say my broad opinion is don't have too strong of an opinion in this space right now. And I think you've seen that play out because a lot of companies have built a lot of tech, and that tech is just not that useful all of a sudden. Like, something changed, and all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't need any of this. And that is like a kind of a wild phenomenon especially for like a big venture-backed ecosystem, right? And so we think about that way too. And there's a little bit of like risk in there. So there's like paranoia of like, well, what do you build? What do you build that's not going to be obsolete in a year? So
what are you building that won't be obsolete in a year?
Error monitoring. That one's going forever, I think. But I don't know, honestly. I think a lot of what we look at. So Sentry has two clean narratives to reason about the way we view the world. One is we find bugs. And we find bugs from the context of what does a bug look like to us? Like, when I open the Uber application and it crashes, clearly it's a bug. Okay, if it's slow, that's a bug too. If it doesn't work correctly, that's a bug. Those are all different kinds of things. So we care about find bugs in abstract, right? And then we're like, okay, let's evolve sort of the vision of Sentry or the constraints of the company a little bit and say, like, what if we find and help you fix bugs? And maybe find and help fix bugs slowly becomes find and just fix bugs, like if the technology sufficiently advances, right? And so a lot of that is like, okay, we have all this telemetry that's super useful. That's the known quantity. That's like the traditional thing that matters still. And then there's like, well, how does Sentry change if you are super optimistic about the future and whatnot, and agents are like a big deal. And one of those things we look at is like, well, how do you make interfaces consumable by, headless agents just as well as they're consumable by humans? Or how do you plug in the data? It's like I built the MCP and I am super passionate about the MCP. I think it has great product market fit already. And the reason I like it is because I'm in a coding agent. All I want to do is fix a problem. I don't care how I fix the problem. I care about correctness and all this, but like with the combination of these things, what happens is I open like Cursor or Claude Code. I say, help me fix, and I drop in the Sentry URL. That queries Sentry, and it queries like a very curated thing, like a journey, if you will, where it has the right information from the error. It has our sort of AI root cause stuff also embedded in there. And it does just enough to feed this into the coding agent, which isn't ours, right? Which is great, to help me like cycle through that whole thing almost hands-free, and in some cases fully hands-free, which is amazing when it works. Again, it doesn't work all the time, but and that's phenomenal. Like if that's all that changed in the industry, that's enough. That's already a huge boost. And so we think about it that way, but then we're like, how do we extend that idea? And so this is more of the futuristic looking avenues for us is like, well, what if we like sort of build this entire like AI debugger, if you will? And so we already have the thing that can kind of root cause, can kind of come up with solutions, though they're a little flaky right now. We've got some tech that will kind of look at different pieces of data and be able to summarize it a lot better. We've got tech that can identify bugs in like pull requests or just diffs now. And what's interesting is this is not even just LLMs. These are combinations of data streams and technologies that work together. And so we're like, okay, we could probably bundle this up and like just make it easier to debug software, because that is like a real thing in the world. And I will tell you, like, I validated this. Like I was talking to a Fortune 10 CTO, which they are not my people for what it's worth. I have no idea what these people's lives are like. And I'm like, how do I broach this AI subject with them? What's their feelings going to be? And interestingly, their feelings are like very aligned. They're like, yeah, it writes really shitty code and it's very good at helping you work through problems, like helping you diagnose systems or stack traces and things like that. I'm like, yes, that's exactly it. And so
because you can evaluate a lot more, right? Yeah. And by evaluating a lot more, you can compare and contrast as well.
Yeah, and it's just so good for that. And so I don't know. I'm cautiously optimistic about what we can do, but I'm also not, it's not like businesses are going to change. We're not going to drastically shift what technology is, how businesses need to run, and all these things. And so I think it's going to look a lot more incremental than, it looks like in the news, if you will, or it looks like in the venture community where everybody's like, oh, these big, crazy, wild bets, which is how it operates, right? That's fine. But I think we'll just be a lot more incremental.
So, Frederick, I just have a quick question, and it's actually not quick, but I'm curious on how this affects engineering teams, at Sentry, in kind of how you do your work, but also, do you see new roles emerging? I mean, we've seen new roles emerge over several decades, where, for systems administrators became SREs, for instance. We saw the emergence of like programmers back a long time ago to the field of software engineering. Do you see roles changing, and do you see engineering practices and, and how your teams are working changing at all with this, or is it business as usual?
I think stuff will change. I would have a hard time saying what. Like, I do think there's going to be some new roles, but I don't think it's going to be drastically different. Like, obviously, you'll have a little bit more specialization, but if you look at LLMs today, it's not specialization realistically. You're just calling an API, and it's like, okay, there's a little bit of learning for like what you want to pass to the API and whatnot, but it's not a complicated subject. This is like you teach somebody this in a day or a week or something, right? And most importantly, just like sort of this full stack concept has become much more common, where it's like you can in some organizations get away with like, oh, I just write CSS or something like this. Generally, what's happened over the years is you actually, to be successful, you need a little bit more breadth, but you also need more depth in certain areas. And so I think we saw that with SRE and all this stuff, right? But even that was like, SRE was like a breadth thing at the end of the day. It went from like pure sysadmin, like you only knew how to like manage like hard servers to like, okay, I'm dealing with cloud services and stringing all this together and whatnot. So I think it's going to be more of that. I do think some roles will change for sure. And so here's a good example is developer infrastructure or productivity or whatever you call your team at your company. That's obviously going to shift to like, how do we enable more of these supporting technologies and whatnot? And maybe that'll create more specialization for like, so things like vendor tools, right? You think about sales tools. Everybody loves sales tools. There's infinite of them. You employ dedicated people for all the random sales tools. Like we have like a Looker engineer on staff. We have Salesforce admins on staff or whatever. People have Jira admins. That will exist for sure, right? And right now in Devonfor, we're like, okay, like somebody's got to be responsible for like, hey, here's how we use Cursor, everybody. Like we have to teach you and enable you and stuff. So that needs to exist, but I think it'll be a little bit repurposing of existing roles. And then I think, so I don't think there's going to be like huge net new roles, but I do think one thing that will be much more common that was probably pretty rare for a lot of orgs is you need some degree of ML on staff because you need some degree of qualitative expertise. Whereas like software is generally deterministic, so you didn't really need this before, but the way you sort of test and validate anything that's not deterministic is so different than the rest that I feel like you do need people with those skills that are not, they're not the skill set of my peers at the very least. Like, 5 years ago, I could not have told you how possibly to evaluate something like an LLM call, right? And these days, I'm still not totally sure how to do it for what it's worth, but I at least have a better grasp on it. But it is that on its own is a deep domain. And I think that is going to be a much more in-demand skill set. What that role turns out to be, I don't know. It could be QA teams become more like that. I'm not sure. But I don't think organizations are going to massively flip or anything, at least not in any like near-term timeline. So
got the dedicated Cursor engineer. That'll be interesting in a company. How much pressure are you getting from your investors, for example, to move faster with all of this stuff? Because we talked to a bunch of these startups on the show too, and they're hearing from their investors, we have to move, we want this, right? And there's a lot of FOMO in the industry. Like, how are you pushing against that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the average sentiment all the time, no matter what. And also, like, on one hand, it's the average sentiment, but it's more like the talked about hypothetical sentiment than the practical sentiment. Investors, especially like the board, the job is like, hey, you should make more money more fast, right? Like that is the job at the end of the day. Nothing's changed here. But there is like a real thing of like, you see a lot of these companies, which I would definitely I'm highly skeptical of, that have grown really fast. And I'm skeptical because I don't think the TAM is real in those. Like, I don't think they've captured markets. I think it's definitely inflated right now. But they're able to grow. Like, lots of companies now have achieved like 100 million in revenue off of like shaky product value. And if you see that and you're driven and you want to succeed, you have to say, how do we capture market fast? Because clearly right now, it doesn't matter if the value is real or not. There is a little bit of this game when you're building a business is like, you need to capture the opportunity and then catch up to the opportunity, right? And so we think about that a lot because there's sort of two truths, You need to adapt the technology to your use cases in the best way you can. Never get left behind, but that's not different than any technology. But the other truth, which is more real in this one, is it's a disruptive technology, which means nobody's safe anymore, which is very, very interesting. But because of that, you don't have to stay in your own lane. And this is what I keep telling people at the company. You can build anything you want. Now, you might already have distribution and you might want to leverage that distribution. So we have developers and we have a lot of tech companies. So we're not going to build like, a social network for, knitters or something like this. I don't know. I'm making something up. But it's like, we could build anything in that domain. It doesn't have to be monitoring because there's really no competitive advantage we have by building adjacency if we're honest with ourselves. And so that's what's really interesting right now. And I think that's where I would put the pressure is like, be bold, because clearly a lot of companies have been able to make a lot of money with, frankly, poor retention, poor GRR, if everybody knows what that means. And that's like a big deal. Like it means there is opportunity for you to turn something into something else. And like, I think I love Cursor. So this is not a slight at them at all. But like, first off, they've competed against Microsoft, which holy shit, like that is hard. They've done it in something that it's unclear that they have any way to have a moat whatsoever. It's a VS Code fork. It's not their models, even though they have some of their own stuff, right? It's all these little things. And if that's all their business was, I would not feel confident that they can survive long term. But they're able to grow so fast that there's so much opportunity for them to turn that into something that's sticky and has some degree of a moat that's not pure well, maybe our product's slightly better or something like that. Because at the end of the day, the people that own the frontier models, they control so much of the narrative, and they actually have the moat, right?
So yeah,
I think it's interesting.
so I get a sense of what you mean by shaky product value. Then is that, what are some other examples of shaky product value? Now, Cursor might have shaky product value because they're a fork of VS Code, but they've been able to scale fast enough so they can, so they may be able to deter, the competition for a while, right?
Yeah, and it can fund other things that maybe forces their own moat, right? But right now, it's like
what are some other examples of shaky product value that you see out there? I mean, you don't have to name names.
So the thing I like to particularly pick at is the low code / no code code gen platforms. And so, and this is not a slight, I think they're phenomenal. Like, it's very cool. But as I look at this just purely logically as a business, I look at things like Bolt or Lovable or Replit, and I'm like, I just don't see it. I see what could be, but I don't see what exists today, if that makes sense. And then I look at my own irrational behavior, and it makes more sense. Like, I last month spent $1,000 personal on random AI services. It's like ChatGPT Pro and Claude Code and Google's Ultra crap or whatever,
It adds up, yeah.
Some of those I did get value, but I also have a corporate subscription on half of these things. And the Google Ultra, I got zero value out of. I just made funny videos, right? And that was the most expensive one. And so that's where it becomes interesting. You're like, okay, there's something here, but everybody's really pushing to like figure out what it could be, which is totally fine, right? But I think the mistake is thinking that those markets exist right now today and that they've achieved PMF, if you will, because I don't think they have. Because if you look at these no-code platforms, I'm just going to call them no-code for lack of better words, they don't really produce a quality product. They don't produce something that I could kind of maintain and stuff. They produce sort of a belief in something that could exist, and I think there's something that could exist, right? But it's just very interesting from that route. And then when you look at that and you're like, okay, if those things are a little bit, questionable and like, they're a little hand wavy in the actual value and how well they work, then what stops you from building something that's hand wavy that works kind of okay, but maybe doesn't quite deliver on the promise that maybe it could in the future? And I'd actually argue our Seer stuff, our root cause and patch fixing, whatever, is exactly that. It's less interesting. It's like less mainstream, if you will. But the patch generation doesn't work at all. Like, I don't know what the percentage, but it's definitely like low double-digit percentage of the time. Is it like a correct enough good patch that you'd want to just use it? But it could exist. And so I think it's okay to make those bets. But I think the majority of the industry is in that situation where the value of it is questionable. I think ChatGPT is a counterexample, though. ChatGPT is a clear value extraction already. Like, everybody gets lots of value out of it today. So
a lot of the companies placing those bets would say, well, the bet we're really placing is on the next model to get so much better, right? I feel like that's the thing we keep hearing all the time. Like, it's not great yet, but just wait for Claude 5 or ChatGPT. Yeah. Well, 5 wasn't that great. But
yeah, I mean, it sounds great if you're Anthropic. It sounds great if you're Anthropic. Yeah. You're like, you know what? That's a good business for us to be into as well, which is 100% the way it looks like it's going to go. And I don't have any inside information here, but right now it kind of looks like the vendors are seeing the opportunity and they're going to go vertical, which is, for me, it's scary. And for me, it's like the particular need for more competition in the sort of frontier model space.
I'll tell you this, David. That next model, that's when my knitting social network's really going to take off.
That's all that was stopping you.
It was all that was stopping me.
That, and he doesn't have a cursor engineer yet who can just keep it, going. But gentlemen, I'm going to get kicked out of this space here right now that we're loaning on this show floor right now at Okta.
I think we've covered a good bit of ground here. I want to thank you, David, for taking some time.
Yeah, it's this fun. Always happy to spend the time. It's good to talk shop. So,
absolutely, it's been a lot of fun, and there's about 25 other things I want to follow up with you on after this conversation. We'll do that another time. So, really appreciate it as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, David.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.
Have fun, Frederick.
Oh yeah. It's Vegas. Alex, you know how much I love Vegas.
I know, it's your town, man.
It's the best city in the world.
You know what the thing is? Vegas will be better next year when Anthropic, improves its next model. So.
That is an area where I'd really love to see.
And David, whiskey always helps with the next model. I bet too.
Model solve all problems. This is what I hear.
That and $15 domestic beers. It's,
Yes, yes. I heard about a $5,000 burger you can get at Mandalay Bay. So,
well, Alex, it's your expense accounts that I'm spending the money on. So,
we need some VCs. We need David's VCs to take us out.
I already spent all of my money on Anthropic, tokens.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. All right. Take care. Yeah.